dedicated to journalists whose persistence hunting the facts makes possible our democracy. In 1838, Abraham Lincoln asked his fellow Americans, "At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will in future be our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular a reverence for the Constitution and laws, and that we improve to the last, that we remained free to the last, that we revered his name to the last, that during his long sleep we permitted no hostile foot to pass over or desecrate his resting place. Shall be that which to learn, the last trump shall awaken our Washington." Posiwid, the purpose of a system is what it does. System theorists coined an acronym to separate beguiling beliefs from real-world facts. Rather than being seduced by what a system is intended to do, they focus on what it in fact does. Posiwid, the purpose of a system is what it does. He's a Grateful Dead fanatic who spread propaganda for anti-communist rebels in Central and South America. He brought MTV's Rock the Vote concept to Russia and hung out with mobsters there. He learned hardball tactics from GOP strategist Roger Stone, fought to bring Twin Peaks back, lost small fortunes, and fled with a parrot to a tugboat off the Florida coast after getting death threats. But there's one thing conservative radio talk show host Michael R. Caputo insists he has never been: a rogue CIA agent. And now he's part of the team working to land Donald Trump the Republican nomination for president in New York State. Perhaps best known as the campaign manager for Carl Palladino's 2010 run for governor, Mr. Caputo now regularly fills in as a political talk show host on WBEN radio. And he is now working with Palladino as part of the New York political team trying to organize support to help Trump win the state's Republican nomination. He makes a pittance of what he used to. Mr. Caputo owes the federal government a huge sum in back taxes, and he irritates local Democrats who label him a paid attack dog. But Mr. Caputo professes not to care. For once, he's happy. "I'm home, finally," he said. An admitted small-time thief and juvenile delinquent growing up in the South Towns, Caputo said his first encounter with Palladino occurred when he accompanied his father to work in the Elliott Square building and tried stealing change from the blind man running the first-floor convenience store. Palladino caught him, repeatedly kicked him in the legs, and threw him out. After Mr. Caputo graduated from high school, his father dropped him off at the Army enlistment station in downtown Buffalo. "If you come back from the service the same way you're going in," Raymond Caputo recalled telling his son, "you're not welcome in my house." The change in him started fast. The day Mr. Caputo realized that President Ronald Reagan was responsible for his 10% Army raise, he became a Republican. Mr. Caputo threw his restless energy to the political right and never looked back. After leaving the Army in 1983, he enrolled in college. That's when his name first appeared in the Buffalo News. Stories appeared about his political pot-stirring efforts at the University of Buffalo, including conservative students' plans to spy and report on radical, liberal professors believed to be closet Marxists. Mr. Caputo signed on as a writer for Congressman Jack Kemp in his White House bid. After that campaign failed, he moved on to Central and South America, where he rubbed elbows with Iran-Contra figure Oliver North, doing his part to spread Reagan's anti-communist doctrine through public relations and propaganda. Mr. Caputo was one of half a dozen light-skinned gringos who connected politicians, journalists, and other public opinion influencers with rebels and other political allies in Latin America. According to J. Michael Waller, who oversaw Caputo's work for the now-defunct Council for Inter-American Security, "We believed in the cause," Waller said, "and we were willing to work for next to nothing." Mr. Caputo later employed his media skills with the House of Representatives and the failed George Bush Dan Quayle re-election campaign. When tumultuous change shook the former Soviet Union in the 1990s, with Russian leaders struggling to build a more democratic and free market society after more than 50 years of communist rule, Caputo staked out his next adventure. He moved there in 1994 as a staff member with the U.S. Agency for International Development, describing Moscow as Paris in the 1920s with automatic weapons. Michael Caputo was one of hundreds of Westerners who flocked to the new Russia to advise people there on how democracy works, said David Hoffman, former Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post. It really was a pioneering time, and not for the faint of heart, said Hoffman, who traded gossip with Caputo back then. Mr. Caputo took up residence in an upscale artist neighborhood and lived next to a cafe that he said was owned by the local mafia. It was the kind of place where one could hear soaring opera music in the morning and find a body dumped at night. Though friendly with senior Kremlin officials, he butted heads with his superiors in the U.S. State Department. The Washington Post reported in 1995 that Mr. Caputo, an obscure advisor to the Russian Election Commission, got his phone, fax, and office keys confiscated for refusing to support a State Department position to the media. Michael Caputo thought about returning stateside, but he stayed, heartbroken over the death of Grateful Dead leader Jerry Garcia, but in love with a Russian astrophysics student, whom he later married. He also opened a public relations firm to help Western companies get a foothold in the newly opened country. It was the ideal time for someone like Michael to open shop, said Michael Conforti, who hired Caputo to get G-Tech's online lottery system established in Russia. It was also a dangerous time. Business people regularly faced threats and more. Roughly 40 were killed in just 1 year, but few were foreigners, Hoffman said. Mr. Caputo recalled one night of heavy drinking with someone he was vetting as a potential local partner for G-Tech and unknowingly insulting the mob-connected man. The man's bodyguards dragged Mr. Caputo out the restaurant's kitchen door, threw him into a car, and took him for a ride before they left him unattended and he got away, he said. Mr. Caputo proved adept at navigating the Byzantine Russian bureaucracy, Conforti said, but in the end it didn't matter. The ruble crashed in the late 1990s. Businesses pulled out, leaving companies like Mr. Caputo's in ruins. So, in 2000, Mr. Caputo finally returned to the United States. He co-founded Rainmaker, a PR firm for budding telecom and internet companies based in Washington, D.C., but also worked for Russians on this side of the Atlantic. Mr. Caputo helped President Vladimir Putin weather U.S. government criticism for taking over an independent TV station. When Rainmaker failed following the dot-com bust, Mr. Caputo took his communications expertise to Allegiance Telecom, a Dallas company fighting to stay in business. That company went bankrupt 2 years later, and with it went his retirement money wrapped up in Allegiance stock. Low money and his marriage on the rocks, Caputo seemed to run out of steam. Mr. Caputo left Dallas and was loafing on his dad's couch in Orchard Park when he got a call from his mentor and close friend, Roger Stone. The bare-knuckled conservative strategist told Mr. Caputo to join him in Miami Beach. From there, Caputo launched Michael Caputo Public Relations, the firm he runs today. When Forbes magazine correspondent Paul Klebnikov was shot to death in Moscow in 2004, Caputo penned a Washington Post column decrying the brutal billionaires of Russia, and one in particular, Boris Berezovsky. Soon after, Caputo said he started getting death threats, so he bought a tugboat and armed himself with a .40 caliber Glock. Off the Florida coast for much of the next 5 years, he let his hair grow, rarely wore shoes, and ran his PR office from his boat with a laptop and a phone. Mr. Caputo kept a white parrot as company. Caputo left his tugboat for a spell in 2007 when he agreed to consult on a parliamentary campaign in the Ukraine. That's where he met his second wife. She insisted he give up politics, and Mr. Caputo agreed to finally set down roots. The couple moved to East Aurora in 2009, and Caputo made plans to join his father's insurance company. Mr. Caputo immediately broke his promise and signed on to manage Palladino's Republican campaign for governor in 2010. Although the run was unsuccessful, Mr. Caputo earned praise from Mr. Palladino. He's a good reactor to chaos. Caputo's office sits above a shoe repair shop in East Aurora. Behind his desk, a statuette of Ronald Reagan stands alongside Jerry Garcia's guitar-wielding figure. Three employees work for him down the hall, 3 more in Miami Beach, and 3 in Moscow. Mr. Caputo says he's not on anyone's local campaign payroll and does work for the Republican Party free of charge. Though Mr. Caputo says he is a proud American, he owes the U.S. government more than $100,000 in back taxes and penalties and has multiple liens against him. It is a classic tale of reinvention, American style. In 2005, Donald Trump wanted to pit an all-black team of contestants against an all-white team to boost ratings on his NBC program, The Apprentice. Mr. Trump said it would be 9 blacks against 9 whites, all highly educated, smart, strong, beautiful people. It would be handled very beautifully by me because, as you know, I'm very diplomatic. NBC executives ultimately rejected the black versus white concept, with one saying, "I don't think so." In August 2006, Mark Burnett was accused of exploiting racial tensions in America with an offensive and cheap series of Survivor, in which the teams are separated according to ethnic background. 4 teams, or tribes as they are known on the show, of 5 members will be made up of blacks, Asian Americans, Hispanics, and whites. They will compete in weekly challenges against each other, and the losing group will have to vote out a member of its own team. Mark Burnett, the series producer, said in a telephone interview yesterday that the decision to organize the teams by race was made in group discussions with CBS executives and was in no way intended to promote racial divisiveness. Mr. Burnett said, "In America today, I really don't believe there are many people who hate each other because of their race. But even though people may work together, they do tend in their private lives to divide along social and ethnic lines." Both CBS and Mr. Burnett acknowledged that the new format could be criticized. "I know it's going to be controversial," he said. "I'm not an idiot." In a statement, CBS said it fully recognizes the controversial nature of the format change, but it expressed confidence in the program's ability to handle the situation sensitively. Mark Burnett called the move an interesting social experiment. Mr. Burnett said, "I don't think it would be valid in the regular modern world. But this is suddenly a very different playing field. People here are playing for $1 million. In 2007, Michael Caputo lived in Ukraine, in Kiev, and worked on a parliamentary election campaign for Bloc Litvin, who had left the political party of President Viktor Yanukovych to form his own party. Mr. Caputo said, "Against the president's party, managed by Paul Manafort, we won." In 2008, Bill Nojoy traveled in Libya during Ramadan celebrations. Nojoy observed how interested the young people were in American schools and politics after decades of repression under Colonel Gaddafi. Their unrest later gave rise to the so-called Arab Spring. In 2008, Donald Trump Jr. said, "Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets." In 2010, Bill Nojoy went back to Ukraine for the presidential elections, where he monitored elections in Uzhgorod, which is north of Transylvania, near the Carpathian Mountains. In 2010, the private wealth division of Deutsche Bank loaned Mr. Trump hundreds of millions of dollars during the same period it was laundering billions in Russian money. In 2014, Eric Trump said, "We don't rely on American banks. We have all the funding we need out of Russia." Facebook, founded in 2004, brought social networking to college students and grandparents alike. In 2009, it is cash flow positive and is expected to bring in $1 billion in revenue. Yet Facebook is stubbornly staying private and has turned to a new kind of investor for the money that otherwise might have come from a public offering. In May 2009, Facebook raised $300 million from a Russian investment firm called Digital Sky Technologies, known as DST. Yuri Milner, DST's chief officer, is Russia's most influential information technology investor. The Israeli-Russian entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and physicist is a graduate of both Moscow State University and the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. In 2011, Mr. Milner played matchmaker between Facebook and a $450 million buy-in from Goldman Sachs. With an additional $50 million in, DST's Facebook holdings topped $500 million. The Russians now own about 10% of the company, meaning they are among Facebook's biggest owners. What do the Russians want from Facebook? Yuri Milner said, "We chose a strategy of total and unconditional focus on the consumer internet, and I would say, even the social internet. The largest newspaper in the United States is only reaching 1% of the population. That compares to internet media, which is used by 25% of the population daily and growing." He had only praise for the business skills of Facebook's 26-year-old co-founder, Mark Zuckerberg, saying he continues to impress with the dynamism of his development as a personality. In 2011, Yuri Milner earned his way onto the Forbes billionaire list and paid a reported $100 million for an estate in Los Altos Hills in the Valley, though he and his family will continue to make Moscow their main home. In October 2012, Mark Zuckerberg met Russia's Prime Minister and former President, Dmitry A. Medvedev, in Moscow. Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Medvedev talked about Facebook's role in politics though only jokingly in reference to its importance in the American presidential campaign. Facebook, in Russia as elsewhere, plays a double role as a tool for posting silly party pictures and a tool for political organizing. Mr. Trump himself was back in Moscow in 2013, attending the Miss Universe pageant, which he owned with NBC. Earlier that year, at the Miss USA pageant in Las Vegas, he had announced that Russia would host the worldwide competition. Erin Brady, that year's Miss USA winner, who watched the announcement from backstage of the auditorium at Planet Hollywood Resort and Casino, said the news was a surprise. She was expecting one of the Latin American countries where beauty pageants are widely celebrated. Ms. Brady said, "I was like, wow, Russia? I never thought of that." Mr. Trump had sold Aris and Emin Aglarov, father and son real estate developers, the right to host his Miss Universe pageant in Moscow that year. Mr. Trump used the visit as a chance to discuss development deals, writing on Twitter at the time, "Trump Tower Moscow is next." "I called it my weekend in Moscow," Mr. Trump said of his 2013 trip to Moscow. "I can't go further than that, but I will tell you that I met the top people and the relationship was extraordinary." As the Russian market opened up in the post-Soviet era, Mr. Trump and his partners pursued Russians who were newly flush with cash to buy apartments in Trump Towers in New York and Florida, sales that he boasted about in a 2014 interview. Mr. Trump told Michael D'Antonio, a Trump biographer who shared unpublished interview transcripts with the New York Times, "I know the Russians better than anybody. I was with the top-level people, both oligarchs and generals, and top-of-the-government people." In 2015, Burnett expressed an interest in building a reality show featuring Putin. Not so much a program about politics, Burnett suggested, as a hymn to the glory of Russia, the humans, the nature, the animals of the nation. On November 13, 2013, New York Assemblyman David DiPietro, Bill Nojay, and Michael Caputo flew from Buffalo to meet with Mr. Trump and his political team. Michael Caputo said, "I had been in Trump Tower before, but Dave and Nojay had not. In Buffalo, we don't have atriums 7 stories high lined with Italian marble." Mr. Nojay had presented to Mr. Trump the fruits of his own research into the qualities that make up successful presidential candidates. In so doing, he also laid out a blueprint for Mr. Trump's presidential bid. Roger Stone said, "Nojay said he had a revelation from Christ that if Trump ran, he would win governor. Generally speaking, I prefer polling data to revelations." Mr. Nojay would return to Trump Tower alone for a series of meetings. A longtime friend, architect Carlton Bud DeWolf, to whom Mr. Nojay often confided in about his meetings with Trump, said, "Bill arrived in his spacious office and Trump was waiting for him. Mr. Trump was very affable. The whole family was also there to meet Bill, at least most of them, but certainly his son, daughter Ivanka, and his wife, plus 2 more. Bill said that Mr. Trump told him that he was possibly running for president. He asked him what he thought. Bill said that the nation needs a different type of president, perhaps an entrepreneur type. And Bill Nojay knew just what he should do. He laid out his ideas in a memo entitled Springboards to the Presidency. Mr. Nojay argued that prior service in elected office was the most direct way to establish a connection to the average voter. Experience showed that having a sparkling military record or a compelling rags-to-riches story would work as well, Nojay wrote. Nojay warned it would be almost impossible because any candidate that has run successfully was a governor, politician, or a high-powered military officer. Mr. Trump could not boast any of those qualities. Trump would need another way to connect with voters, and Mr. Nojay laid out another pathway, one that, in retrospect, seems to be precisely the one followed by candidate Trump. The candidate must have a clear mission that appeals to many voters and is delivered under circumstances of urgency or near crisis. This is the candidate as indispensable problem solver of a must-solve problem. Mr. Trump took to the campaign trail to assert darkly that the nation was in a shambles, hemorrhaging jobs, riddled with crime, threatened by ISIS, and that only he could provide solutions and make America great again. At the end of the meeting that day, DeWolf said Trump thanked Bill Nojay and told him he would have to think seriously in light of their conversation. As Donald Trump finds new ways to drag out his vicious feud with the National Football League, he tweeted Monday morning that there's no leadership in the NFL. A big question looms about where this all began. Could it be, as several reports now suggest, that this whole national trauma can be traced back to Trump's failed attempt to buy the Buffalo Bills back in 2014? That's what some team owners have reportedly said, contending that the president is driven by a personal grudge stemming from his multiple doomed efforts over the decades to become the owner of an NFL franchise. Jacksonville Jaguars owner Shahid Khan told USA Today that Trump is jealous of the league and its owners, having failed to become one. Mr. Khan said he's been elected president, where maybe a great goal he had in life, to own an NFL team, is not very likely. But come on, how badly did Trump really want to buy the Bills? Badly enough, it seems, to create a dubious grassroots campaign to pressure the team and the league to not sell to a rival group of bidders. Back in early 2014, with the team for sale and potential buyers in the process of being narrowed to 3 finalists, Trump, Buffalo Sabres owner Terry Pegula, and a group of Toronto investors led by John Bon Jovi, speculation was rampant that the would-be Canadian buyers planned to move the franchise north of the border. That's when a local fan group sprang up, hoping to turn sentiment in Buffalo against Bon Jovi and his partners. These activist Bills backers called themselves 12th Man Thunder and began orchestrating colorful stunts like establishing Bon Jovi-free zones in local bars, antics that earned them ink everywhere, from Breitbart to New York Magazine. But what almost nobody knew until now is that the whole thing was pulled together by the then future President of the United States. In the spring of 2014, Trump hired veteran Republican operative and Buffalo resident Michael Caputo, a close associate of Paul Manafort and Roger Stone. Mr. Caputo had worked with Ollie North during the Reagan years and then helped boost the careers of Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin as a political consultant in Russia. Now, he was enlisted to create a group that would scuttle Bon Jovi's NFL chances. After my work with Donald Trump to try and convince him to run for governor, he decided he wanted to buy the Buffalo Bills, which really interests me because I grew up next to the stadium. During that time, I was actually on the phone with Mr. Trump a lot. He was very excited about buying the Buffalo Bills. So I was responsible for public affairs. A mutual friend of ours was in charge of the lobbying, and another mutual friend of ours was in charge of the legal work. One other buyers group who was really favored to win was going to move them to Toronto. That was John Bon Jovi's group. Mr. Trump's goal was to buy them and keep them in Buffalo, which was really important to all of us. Trump knew he couldn't outbid the Canadians, Caputo recounted. Instead, Caputo explained, he would scare them off by turning Buffalo against them. 2 days after we spoke, the president took the stage at a political rally in Alabama and began his smoldering feud with the NFL by calling any player who showed the temerity to kneel during the national anthem a son of a bitch. Having been publicly involved with a board of efforts to launch Trump into New York's gubernatorial race the year before, Caputo was too closely associated with the mogul to be the public face of the 2014 effort, so he recruited others. Mr. Caputo said, "I had it all set up with neighborhood guys who live by the stadium." In a stroke of cunning, Caputo recruited Chuck Sontag, a double amputee cancer survivor, to serve as the group's leader. Press coverage would occasionally identify Caputo as a PR consultant to the group, while reporting that it was founded by Sontag, as he lay recovering from his amputations in a rehabilitation center. It was easier for Sontag to lose his leg than his team, Caputo recalled. Astroturfing like this, covertly funding a supposedly grassroots group, was not a new tactic for Trump and his operatives. Back in 2000, Stone and Trump's Atlantic City casino business paid massive fines after they funneled $150,000 to a group called the Institute for Law and Society to run newspaper ads opposing the legalization of a Native American casino in the Catskills, and failed to disclose the transaction to New York's lobbying regulators. Trump's involvement in the Buffalo scheme was short-lived. According to Caputo, not long after 12th Man Thunder was formed, Trump entered a $1 billion bid for the bills, and as a condition of that offer, was forbidden from participating in public outreach efforts related to the sale. So, as Caputo recalls, Trump called him and told him that he had to break off contact with him and the fan group. And then one day, Mr. Trump called me and said he had just signed some kind of NDA and he could no longer speak to me, and that all of my work in public relations, I'm on my own. I can't talk to you anymore because of the NDA I signed, Caputo remembers Trump saying. Have a good time. Charlie Pellion, a Buffalo local who co-founded the group, said that keeping a lid on Trump's involvement was a challenge. Pellion said it was all behind the scenes and we weren't even allowed to mention his name because of the agreement that he signed. I was bursting at the seams to tell people, hey, this was Donald Trump's idea. Mr. Caputo got the underlying message. You know, you can do it. Please do. But I can't talk to you about it. With Trump having removed himself from the picture, Caputo took the gloves off. Mr. Caputo said, we immediately made it far more aggressive and anti-Toronto than the president ever envisioned, mostly because we didn't have to worry about getting him crossways with the NFL. The group gathered thousands of signatures for a petition demanding the team remain in Buffalo and started a Ban Bon Jovi movement to rid upstate New York of the New Jersey rockers' music. A local radio station, Jack FM, started playing a version of Livin' on a Prayer with new lyrics. Johnny used to get played on Jack. Now he wants our bills, but Buffalo just won't take that. He's whack. And it worked, partially. Bon Jovi didn't get the bills, but neither did Trump. Instead, in September 2014, the team went to Pegula, was kept it in Buffalo. Bon Jovi called Mr. Trump an evil genius. Bon Jovi said, it's genius what he did because he was taking out a serious candidate to buy the team and then hoped that he would get it at a bargain price. But we were as real got, and you know, I'm brokenhearted because I would have loved it. Bon Jovi said the disappointment over losing the team, along with major disruptions in his music career, helped send him to therapy. I'm over it now, but it took years of therapy to get over it. Without an NFL team to run, Trump entered the presidential race 9 months later, capitalizing on anti-foreigner sentiment, outrageous stunts, and the enthusiasm of colorful, grassroots groups to win the presidency. A year after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Cold War historian Raymond L. Garthoff said, "We can now have high confidence in the judgment that there were no successful moles at the political decision-making level on either side. There is also no evidence of any major political or military decision that was crucially influenced, much less generated, by an agent of the other side." In December 2014, Peter Pomerantsev wrote a New York Times opinion piece titled, "Russia's Ideology, There Is No Truth," part of which follows. Imagine if you grew up lying, not a little bit for convenience, but during every public moment of your life, at school, at work, at social events. You had to lie to survive, because the punishment for telling the truth was the loss of your academic or professional career, or even prison. For Russians who came of age before 1991, this is the only way they know. The Kremlin's goal is to control all narratives, so that politics becomes one great scripted reality show. The way it wields power illustrates and reinforces this psychology. Everything is public relations. Cynicism is useful to the state. When people stop trusting any institutions or having any values, they could easily be spun into a conspiratorial vision of the world. This mindset resonates well in a post-Iraq and post-financial crisis West, increasingly skeptical about its own institutions, where reality-based discourse has already fractured into political partisanship. Conspiracy theories are prevalent on cable networks and radio shows and among supporters of far-right parties in the United States. December 2014, the New York Times editorial board warned in an op-ed, "Facebook is not the public square." Dissidents in Russia and elsewhere are upset that Facebook has blocked an event page for a demonstration to support a leading opposition figure at the behest of the government of President Vladimir Putin. While their outrage is understandable, Facebook's decision serves as an important reminder that social media companies are under no obligation to support free speech if doing so would harm their business. Facebook officials have declined to address publicly their decision to remove the page for Alexei Navalny, a vocal critic of Mr. Putin. The page is still available outside of Russia. Data from Facebook show that it has increasingly blocked content in response to government requests. Because social media businesses have become such a fixture in modern life, many people think of them as the digital equivalent of the public square where opinions can be freely shared. If Facebook made a practice of defying requests from Russian officials, it would be entirely conceivable that Mr. Putin and his officials would block the site in the country altogether. As much as free speech advocates would like Facebook and other internet companies to uphold liberal values, these companies are unlikely to do so if that means sacrificing lucrative business opportunities. Like a starlet who keeps returning to a favorite director, Trump had always loved the way that Mark Burnett made him look. When Trump announced his candidacy in 2015, he did so in the atrium of Trump Tower and made his entrance by descending the gold-colored escalator, choreography that Burnett and his team had repeatedly used on the show. After Trump's announcement, reports suggested that people who had filled the space and cheered during his speech had been hired to do so, like TV extras, for a day rate of $50. Justin McConney, a former director of new media for the Trump Organization, told New York that, whenever Trump works with camera people, he instructs them, "Shoot me like I'm shot on The Apprentice." In 2015, the Taj Mahal was fined $10 million, the highest penalty ever levied by the feds against a casino, and admitted to having willfully violated anti-money laundering regulations for years. Mark Burnett told the Washington Post in January 2016, "Donald mentioned a number of times, maybe I'll run for president one day." Mark Burnett can see Russia from his office. The reality TV super producer behind the TLC hit Sarah Palin's Alaska, along with NBC stalwart The Voice, CBS's Survivor, and ABC's Shark Tank, among others, has his eye on a series that would go inside the world of global government leaders. "I want this to be a series of shows from the eyes of leaders of nations about their countries," Burnett, 54, tells THR, "not through the lens of a news organization." Burnett, who with wife Roma Downey has become a top scripted TV producer in addition to his reality empire, cites Palin's Alaska, which shattered TLC records when it premiered to 5 million viewers in late 2010, as an example of what he would like to do. Rather than focus on the former Alaska governor and 2008 vice presidential candidate's political life, the docuseries showcased her personal experiences in Alaska, ice trekking, salmon fishing, baking for her children. In promoting the series, Burnett noted consistently how disinterested he is in politics. Mr. Burnett said, "I have no idea about the politics. I have had great fun, watching it. And, sad to say, politics is kind of a TV show." First on his wish list, Russia's Vladimir Putin. Seeing Russia through its controversial president's eyes has Burnett so excited, he has already reached out to Putin, 62, a noted outdoorsman and former KGB officer. When it is suggested the Russian leader probably would ignore such a request, Burnett cracks a smile. "How do you know that? I would think I could probably get through to most people." Mr. Burnett says he emphasized his show would be devoid of armies and politics. Rather, it would focus on the humans, the nature, the animals of the nation. If all goes as he hopes, others, including Cuba's Fidel Castro, would follow. William R. Noje only rarely spoke publicly about the role he'd played in Mr. Trump's run for president. Having helped launch Trump on the path to the White House, Mr. Noje didn't live to see the final act. The assemblyman and lawyer from Pittsford died by suicide 2 months before the historic 2016 election. Abraham Lincoln said, "He who represents himself has a fool for a client." I am told he had this printed on his business card when he practiced law prior to becoming President of the United States. In his book, A Fool for a Client, Roy Cohn described himself as a prosecutor of second-string communist leaders. Morley Safer described Roy Cohn as a sybarite without any assets who maintains a permanent expensive tan. Over the years, many acquaintances would remark on Donald Trump's resemblance to another blonde, rich boy obsession of Mr. Cohn, G. David Shine. In his biography of Roy Cohn, Nicholas von Hoffman reported how a summer friend described Mr. Cohn's behavior at a gay bar in Provincetown. Roy sang 3 choruses of God Bless America, got a hard-on, and went home to bed. In September 2020, President Trump's top spokesman at the Department of Health and Human Services delivered a speech on Facebook Live and said there were rotten scientists in a resistance unit at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Michael R. Caputo, facing mounting criticism for leading official efforts to water down reports on the coronavirus pandemic, suggested that he personally could be in danger from opponents of the administration. He warned his Facebook followers, "If you carry guns, buy ammunition, ladies and gentlemen, because it's going to be hard to get." Mr. Caputo said, "I don't like being alone in Washington. With the shadows on the ceiling in my apartment, there alone, shadows are so long." In The Exhausted West, his 1978 address at Harvard, Alexander Solzhenitsyn decried America's decline in courage. Historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote back to Mr. Solzhenitsyn in an op-ed published in newspapers across the United States. Knowing the crimes committed in the name of a single truth, Americans prefer to keep their ears open to a multitude of competing lowercase truths. Ours has been a nation of skepticism, experiment, accommodation, self-criticism, piecemeal but constant reform, a collection of traits repugnant to the authoritarian and messianic personality, but perhaps not too bad for all that. Posiwid. The purpose of a system is what it does.